This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold. Hi listeners, before we start, I want to talk to you about community. A podcast is a group effort. There's the hosts, the guests, and of course you, the audience. The more everyone works as a team, the better the show can and will be. Now we know all of you are busy people. So in order to make things as quick and easy as possible, we've put up a short survey on the show's website at obeythedna.com that you can fill out in just a few minutes. Doing so will help us to know how to make the show even better for you, our listeners, and grow this little podcast community of ours. So please drop by obeythedna, that's one word, obeythedna.com, and click on the listener survey button at the top. Let us know about your tastes and what kind of show you want this to be, so we can continue to make it even more awesome. Thanks for listening, and now on with the show.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions, gamers dominate the tabletop, and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Hey.
And our guest host, Jack Ward.
How's it going?
And so tonight, we're going to be talking about the changing nature of nerdliness.
Did you just create a word, nerdliness?
Is nerdliness not a real word?
I don't think I've ever heard of it specifically called nerdliness. But I think it is the state of being a nerd.
Yes.
Nerditude.
That's exactly what it would be.
Nerditude, nerdliness, nerdifaction.
Yes. Nerdifaction.
Nerdifaction.
We are the Department of Nerdly Affairs, sir. We take our nerdliness very seriously.
There you go. Take your shot every week.
Nerdlifaction would be the state of becoming a nerd, wouldn't it?
Oh, there you go. Isn't that nerdmogrification?
I think Jack's got you on that one, Don.
Yeah, it's a hard one to beat.
It's a hard one to say. So when did nerds start?
That's a very good question. I would assume that there have always been nerds. Nerds have always been reclusive types, introverts, who basically live within their own heads. And I think that that's always been part of the human condition, the human nature. There have always existed those people. I mean, if there weren't, we wouldn't get people like Plato and Aristotle back in the ancient Greeks. There have been nerds throughout history. Even before there were books, there were probably nerds who were just into art, for example, or drawing pictures on cave walls.
They just weren't called nerds. I can tell you where the first appearance of nerd came from as the word nerd.
Really?
Okay. Yep. I happen to have the internet with me.
Oh my god.
I packed it up and took it away from the lords of the internet. They lent it to me. That's a reference for anybody who watches IT Crowd. But anyway, it's a nerdly show to watch for a nerd thing. No, Dr. Seuss's book, If I Ran the Zoo, where one of the creatures' name is a nerd. Mm-hmm. You can collect a Nurgle, a nerd, and a seersucker too for his imaginary zoo. But that's the first time it was used, but it was used in the 50s as somebody who was sort of overly intellectual, obsessive, or lacking social skills. Or
that would make sense.
Yeah. Sometimes shy, quirky, unattractive.
Right.
In the 50s, they sort of definitively had the stereotype of the nerd as the person with the glasses, who sort of was uncoordinated, certainly not wearing any fashionable clothes, and sort of had his nose in a book on a regular basis.
Right. That may have been the 50s stereotype, but that image of the bookworm, as I guess it was probably called before then, is a classic one. I mean, it goes pretty much right back to, books. And definitely to, let's see, I can think of examples from, the Victorian period. that kind of person existed? I mean...
But I'm going to challenge you on this. Yeah, that person
What?
existed, but were they really considered to be social outcasts? Because I think we got into this modern age where anti-intellectualization was the cool thing, right?
That's true.
Where if you go back to Elizabethan era and stuff like that, it was pretty cool to be able to read.
That's true.
Right? Yeah. So to sit there and say those people, those were nerds, I don't know. Maybe nerds were a whole different thing if you want to talk about being social outcasts.
That's true. There was a time when people who could read and write were scribes, and they were poets, and they were other valued members of society.
Right. Especially valued. Now, you might argue that maybe an accountant at the time might have been more of a nerdly person because they weren't doing anything of worth, as people would say, right? They were just moving numbers kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But somebody who was making books, remember, this is a time where that was the entertainment, right? People being able to recite poetry, people being able to do dramatic stuff in books. The stuff that we relegate to nerds nowadays was the stuff that people desperately needed, sort of as a way to escape from where they were back then.
That's true.
I'm thinking, from what you guys have both brought up, there is some kind of shift between, maybe not nerds specifically, but that niche in society. Because if you do go back to Victorian era, even just immediately pre-World War II, you had the idea of the intellectual, but there was the bad intellectual, which we'd consider the counterculture type, which is where you had, say, the anarchists. Mm-hmm. You had they used to call them long hairs, where that was starting around the 1920s. That being the idea of like the philosopher who sits around intellectualizing without really contributing to society. And that kind of ferments ideas opposed to society.
Wow. You know what I was thinking? There are, people that you could say throughout history were considered to be, we would consider nowadays, looking back, maybe nerds. So somebody like Oscar Wilde.
That's true.
Right.
Oscar Wilde would be like, if he came today, he would be like a classic nerd, right? Mm-hmm. Because again, he was this sort of counterculture to a certain degree. A lot of people couldn't handle him, right?
I thought Oscar Wilde was more of like the classic flamboyant homosexual stereotype.
And I think there's a key there. I think that, again, nerd is a social outcast, right? So this was this part of the social outcast of the time.
Right.
So maybe there is that intrinsic aspect of things that are outside of what is the norm of society, and including intellectuals and dreamers and stuff like that. You can't just be outside of it and being a dunderheaded sports person or something. No, you have to be somebody who's knowledgeable and maybe a little dangerous that way. Maybe that's the issue, is that people, they want to keep these people down because they know stuff.
Ooh.
Nerds are dangerous.
I think that's sometime approaching the 50s or the 60s, I think, is where you had that shift. That the idea of the nerd, of the unrestrained intellectual, like that's where it comes from, and they were dangerous. And the irony being, when you got to say 40s and the 50s, knowing things was good, but it had to be the right thing. So you could be an atomic scientist, and those were the men driving the future. It's transistors and atomic energy. But if you were like a philosopher, you were dangerous because like he's talking about those weird foreign sounding writers, and isn't this guy a communist? And
yeah,
but it's even more dangerous than that, because the nerd has the possibility of stealing your women. And the reason we know that is the Nutty Professor.
Yeah.
Right? Jerry Lewis made a living off of being the nerd that turns around and becomes the suave guy, which makes him so dangerous to people, right?
Right.
In that situation. So you got to keep those nerds down because
Otherwise, they're going to come and steal our women.
they're going to steal your women. That's, oh my God, we're onto something here. Because I know the Nutty Professor came out in 1963, so that's still in the earlier stages of, oh my God, be careful of the nerd. They're dangerous.
And that kind of went right up on probably until the 90s. Because you think about that was like every wacky teen comedies from Animal House on. That was the basic premise.
Yeah. Well, even Nerds, the big one that was kind of like Animal House, right? The Revenge of the Nerds. It hung on the fact that they had all kinds of skills and just lacked the confidence. So that's where that's where you got to keep the nerds' confidence down, because if they organize, you're in real trouble. But you're right. Even in the Nutty Professor sequel came out in 96 too. So yeah, all the way up into the 90s, you've got this idea of we got to keep a lid on these nerds. And then what happened? They burst out.
Yep.
They took over the world.
They got loose.
And that's Bill Gates, right?
Well, actually, I think where the turning point came in the Nerds 1 was in the 90s when Trekkies became Trekkers.
Right.
Okay.
Because I think what ended up happening was Trekkies were generally looked down upon by society and other countercultures until the 90s. And I think what the shift was a lot of the 90s is when you really started the era of the remake, the era of the reboot, bringing stuff back. And the big companies realized if you could cultivate Trekkies of your own, you had a built-in, ready-to-go audience.
Yeah.
But that already kind of existed with Star Wars, though. Star Wars created that. The idea of the absolute ardent science fiction fan. I mean, fans existed before Star Wars, of course.
Right.
But actually, we should probably take a step back here. So we know that the very first science fiction convention, we talked about in a previous show, were back in the 1930s, I believe it was, or late 20s. There were actual early proto-science fiction conventions where people who today we would probably call nerds gathered together and they engaged in fandom. We talked about that. I think Jack was even on that episode where we talked about that.
And I was shocked because you were telling me about the Shmoo, or no, it wasn't the
Mr. Skygak.
Oh yeah, that was a very bleak and surreal moment when I looked that one up. That was crazy.
Mr. Skygak. Yep.
But these were very, very much on the fringes. Most people.
That's true.
I'm a nerd, and I didn't hear of that until you guys talked about it.
Oh yeah, because that's even by nerd standards, that's super esoteric stuff.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, we went into the 40s. Now, here's an interesting question. How do you think that World War II, because let's be a little more chronological, how do you think World War II changed nerddom? Like, what effect did World War II have on being a nerd? Because they did exist before that time. Not maybe called that, but they were bookworms or whatever, but they existed.
Did I tell you my sister's theory about World War II and the men leaving to go to war?
No, go ahead.
And I think she's got something really strong here. And I think World War II led into the 60s in this way. That my dad, for example, his father, my grandfather, had gone to World War II, volunteered because he's in Canada, and they weren't.
There was no draft.
There was no draft. I was trying to say subscripted, but it's not that.
Conscripted.
Conscripted. There you go. It's one of those prefixes. So he was conscripted. Or he wasn't conscripted. He went on his own. And so my father, for the formative years of his life, up to about 8 or 9, he was brought up by my grandmother. So he was brought up with different values. And so he was given a longer license to be a kid, and he got a chance to see women in equal roles. So suddenly when my grandfather came back, you couldn't put that genie back in the bottle because my grandmother was working full time. She used to be a housewife before that. She stayed at home doing all that stuff. But for my father's early years, she worked constantly and did all these other things. So he got to see, great equalization going on. And that's what sort of drives everything from Star Trek to nerddom to all those kind of ideas of, we can do this and we don't have to have these prescribed roles that, son, as soon as you hit this age, go out and get a job like me and work yourself to death at 12. And you know what I mean? You will be the lord of your own manor and all that kind of thing that we had in the past, that all changed.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Makes sense. Also, the idea, too, that, like, the post-war economy in North America gave everybody, there was more money, so there was more, you had more freedom, and people had the liquid cash to spend on dumb shit.
Yep.
There's that, too.
And more recreational time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big one.
To figure out dumb shit.
Like what they want to do with their life.
Oh my god, I think I just swore the first time in my podcasting career on the air. Feels so dirty. All right.
There's no stopping him now.
Gonna have to bleep that out. Start throwing out.
Jesus fucking Christ, Jack! Get it together.
All those Saxon words.
This isn't Greg Taylor's Dakota Ring Theater, dude. You can swear. It's okay.
There you go. I have an image, and it's vastly shattering. So yeah, but that's, and then we get into World War, then we get into the 50s, right? So World War II, you have these kids that are brought up by parents that are brought up by women, generally, and so then you see this breakout of that kind of roles. You have a ton of cash coming in the post-war economy that creates this idyllic time, which is George Lucas's favorite time of the world in the 50s, where everybody is drag racing, wearing leather jackets, chatting up girls, and obviously dreaming, because he created Star Wars, right?
Right. Yep.
So the 50s creates all that, and maybe that's when nerds start sticking out, because it's the 50s when people start using that phrase. Maybe that's when all these dreamers start sticking out in society, and people are going, who are these, these people who keep their nose in books, and they come up with every kind of euphemism to call them. It's never just nerd, right? There's a ton of different words for them. Poindexter is always one of my favorites.
Yeah, I like that one too. Yeah. I can totally see that. Yeah, I can totally see that. I think also in the 50s we have the whole science thing. Remember, that's the point where science becomes everything. Science is power at that point.
Yeah.
And because of the atomic bomb and the space program and everything. So suddenly we have this idea that the people who, going back to what you were saying earlier, the people who understand science and the people who are focused on science are powerful.
Right.
I think there's a catch though. Because I think you guys are right, but something weird happens, because I think the 50s is where you get what we'd consider the past modern nerd, because that's changed recently. But if you remember with the Poindexters, there was one underlying thing that started in the 50s, is the Poindexters were always the Law and Order types.
True.
Like, it wasn't just that you always had your head in the book, but you were there to kind of, like, you were the one who would tell teacher when people get out of turn, and you didn't want to, like, go investigate the old creepy house because we're not supposed to go in there, and what if the cops catch us and that.
Oh, isn't that Waldo, or wasn't that his name is Waldo? No, it wasn't Waldo. It was something like that from the Little Rascals, the Argang kid. Remember? There was a really smart Poindexter kid there. His name was like Waldo or something like that. And
he was always chasing Darla. I can't remember.
Yeah, he was always chasing Darla, and he was always just the worst snob, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's because he's a nerd, that they didn't want. He was smarter. He was too smart for his own good, right? That was the whole thing that they had. And again, that was the old idea of the nerd. You got to keep those guys down because they'll get uppity.
Yeah.
Right. Well, okay, so we got the 50s, And we've got Science is King, and we've got the rise of the nerd culture. We start to see it there. We got the science fiction pulp magazines. We got Amazing Stories. We got all that stuff going on. And so then in the 60s, we get nerdly television, of course, because at the beginning of the 60s, we get Star Trek.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there was already some idea of like weird people and weird kids and stuff. I mean, the Munsters already existed. The Addams Family already existed. Although, you know, I've always thought it was interesting that neither the Munsters nor the Addams Family have a nerd character.
I'll tell you where the big nerd character comes in that area, though.
Where?
1964.
Okay.
Gilligan's Island. Who's the nerd? Professor.
Yeah.
He's the ultimate nerd, though, right? He's not the nerd that nobody wants to be around unless he starts talking sciencey stuff. Mm-hmm. Generally, though, he's well respected, and he's the guy who's got the all the answers that they need. Mm-hmm. I mean, he makes a radio out of coconuts, for crying out loud.
Yeah, exactly, and a couple rubber bands.
But he can't fix a 1-foot hole in a boat.
That's right. Well, they had the boat on the shore for a while, and then it's no longer there. It just sort of like, what, did they set it on fire or something? So, But no, that's a perfect example of, almost, this is where you're starting to see the difference, right? Because in the 50s, you get, like you said, you got these B science flicks of, mad scientists and aliens and all this kind of stuff, but it brings forth opportunities. And that's, again, when you start seeing even space shows like in the 50s and stuff like that, you've got these ideas of kids' space shows of going to the moon and all those kinds of things.
Tom Corbett, Space
Cadet, right? All that kind of stuff. So by the time we get to the 60s, we've got, well, wait a minute, then we need to have that science hero.
Yeah, that's true.
Although it's interesting because the Professor, in a lot of ways, is a parody of the scientists from the 50s. Because the 50s, you had the guys who were like the atomic energy expert, which could be used to diagnose what's turning this guy into an alien for some reason. But they were also like the two-fisted adventurers, and they were all like retired fighter pilots, and they wouldn't just like find the way to stop the monster. They'd go out and like punch it in the face and then get the girl in the end.
The Doc Savage
guy. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing.
Yeah, Doc Savage, who of course was a super scientist and a martial artist and everything else under the sun.
And everything. Yep. He's kind of like the Superman in his group. You think, why does he need all these operatives? This is like Justice League. Doc Savage is like the Superman of Justice League. You know what I mean? Like, why do you got Superman? You don't need a league. You got everybody there.
Yeah, exactly.
Moral
support. That's right. I'm so glad you showed up, Aquaman. Keep looking at that monitor for me, okay? Oh, jeez, not again.
Poor Aquaman.
Yeah, and it's not a monitor; it's an aquarium, and they're just playing games with him the whole time. It's so sad. What about Japan at this time? What about Japan at this time? Because they keep talking about, like, I was listening to this really cool podcast called The Department of Nerdly Affairs, and they were talking about Ultraman, and I was still waiting to hear which series of Ultraman I should listen to. But anyway, and they were saying that there's like super scientists there that are involved in creating Ultraman. I think that's a theme even in Japan. So in other cultures, this aspect.
Oh yeah,
of
they definitely
science.
had that. But theirs is a little bit different because they, unlike America, don't have that anti-intellectual streak. Yeah. So in Japan at this time, the smart guy is still highly valued.
Nice.
Like they don't have that. They don't have that aspect where you're the one with your nose in the book all the time. Therefore, for whatever reason, you are now like lesser or unworthy just because you're into weird stuff. They didn't have that back then. They would develop it later. We can talk about that later. But at the time, they didn't.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So did they grab onto the idea of the nerd from North American shows, and that's what developed it?
I don't think so. In Japan, the bookworm nerd aspect came more from the otaku culture, which is the culture of basically shutting yourself away and focusing your entire life on whatever that thing is that you're focusing your entire life on. Yeah. Like, they're what we would call obsessive nerds. Okay, so for example, in Japan, if you're a nerd, that usually means you have one area where you are like the absolute master of your domain, but it's something like really, really obsessive, like collecting toys from pinball machines or something like that.
Right.
It's like super detailed nerd. They're like obsessive nerds. That's where their nerd idea comes from. You've got every single character from this anime, you've got all the dolls of them or something like that, and you know everything about them, and probably write little stories about them and whatever else. That's the Japanese nerd. Traditionally, the Japanese nerd.
Yeah, actually, the best way to explain it would be, we have fanboys here. Japan has otaku. A fanboy is somebody who's like read every issue of the X-Men, memorized every detail, and will totally get in your face if you dare say that Cyclops could beat Wolverine in a fight. Whereas an otaku will have every issue of the X-Men wrapped in a plastic bag that they've never read because it has nothing to do with like enjoying it. They're just obsessively amassing anything that ever had the X-Men in it.
Oh, the Simpsons collector.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
You've
pretty much
taken it out of its package. It's lost its value.
Exactly.
Yeah, got it. Got it.
Yep. I mean, we've got them here too, but Japan has lots of them.
You could argue that we didn't really develop those as widespread in comics until like the 90s when we had all the McFarlane days, right? Where people were really collecting the artwork and not even reading the comics, or buying 3 of them, reading 1 and keeping 2, in their little bags.
Yeah.
Well, we had the seeds of that in the 80s.
Right.
Well, okay, let's go back in time, semi-chronological again. So something else that happened in the 60s that I don't think we've talked about yet, I know we haven't, is the idea of zines. Yeah. Zine culture also started to pop up in the 60s.
Did it really?
Where what happened is we had photocopiers for the first time. So people started making their own little like small press magazines, which in some ways functioned as the first blogs. Because you basically wrote these little magazines that were sometimes just a couple pages. You photocopied maybe 20 of them, and then you shared them with your friends or other zine writers and such. This was kind of a counterculture thing.
Yeah.
So did this start in San Francisco with sort of like the comics and the Freak Brothers and all that kind of stuff, and then sort of move across the country, or where did zines get their start?
It goes back a little farther because the zines weren't always like comics. They were if you remember the 70s and the 80s, we had what they'd call trade mags,
right?
And the zines were kind of like indie culture, counterculture versions of that.
Sure.
Right. And the thing about the zines is they started letting counterculture intellectuals, in other words, nerds, but other groups as well on campuses and such, communicate with each other.
Yeah.
Like they would actually, you could actually like mail to get zines. Like there were actual magazines that existed that were just, here's lists of places you can write, and they'll send you a zine if you send them like postage.
Yeah.
And so they started like trading these zines back and forth. And this is important because it was the zine writers, it was the zine culture that would actually lead the revolution to bring back Star Trek after it got canceled.
Well, I was going to say, are they the first ones who created like the fan stories?
That's exactly right. The very first fan fiction were zine fiction.
Yeah. Right.
Yep. At least the first fan fiction, true fan fiction we know. There was what you could call semi-fan fiction, which was fan fiction with the names filed off. That that happened in magazines even back in the 30s and 40s.
And rip-offs.
We call them rip-offs, actually, if you want to call it. But in terms of true people, writing stories about Kirk and Spock being lovers, that's from the zines. That's the zine culture.
Those make me angry. Those slash fictions. But yeah, that brings up the rage. Apparently, 1940 was the first science fiction fanzine.
Okay.
Did you know that? I didn't.
No, I didn't.
That's very cool. No, and the thing is, even some of those fan stories ended up in collections in books, because I have strange. I think it's called Strange or New Voyages. Voyages, New Voyages 1 and New Voyages 2, and they're like Susan Stackhouse collecting people's shorts of Star Trek, which are effectively fan tales, right? You know,
Yeah,
what
they're
I mean?
fan fiction. Yeah,
They're fan fiction that they put together and actually, because they were written beforehand, and then they were decided which ones would be the best for this collection, this anthology collection of stories.
yes.
And then I guess they started doing those in magazines, like actual magazines, and that's what you think that's what drove the desire to have Star Trek back?
But that was part of the
It wasn't just
movement.
the reruns?
Well, I mean, people were being inspired by the reruns. I mean, there were many things. It wasn't just that. But I've
Sure.
always read that the zine culture helped to keep Star Trek alive and helped to promote it at a time when there wasn't any Star Trek on the air. Here, just like those YouTube video productions of new Star Trek episodes they've been doing for the last 10 years since Enterprise went off the air.
Yep.
Right.
Except for now they're going to be killed by...
Yes, yeah, they're officially can't do those anymore. But the thing is, they're serving that exact same purpose. Think about it. It was people writing new Trek stories when they didn't have Trek.
Yeah.
Well, they did the same thing for Doctor Who, though, too. Here's my question. Did they do the same thing for Doctor Who before they started doing them for Star Trek? No, because Doctor Who was still on the air then.
Yes,
Yeah.
Doctor Who was on the air, but Star Trek wasn't.
Star Trek wasn't, yeah. That's right.
So, yeah, the answer is that, I mean, I'm sure there were, as you said, other science fiction zines, but the Trek zine culture was very important. It was very important to nerdliness in the sense that it was the nerd community kind of banding together.
Yeah.
Well, I remember,
With a single
I remember
focus.
in the early 80s being involved in like a newsletter, which basically was a zine, which was a Star Trek newsletter. And they gave all the people who wanted to do... like I wrote an article into it and stuff like that. So they gave me my honorary captainship, and stuff like that.
That's cool.
Captain Ward writes from the armrest of Captain Ward, right?
Right, that's cool.
I think it was the USS Pearson, because the person who created it, she said it should really be called Pearson because Pearson created our Prime Minister Pearson created the whole aspect of peacekeepers, and she saw that as sort of a forerunner to the whole idea of Star Trek and the Federation, which is cool. I mean, I think she's right there. So
Yeah, definitely.
Wasn't that like the late 70s? Didn't they start doing that? That the fan clubs were each, because I remember stuff about it. Each fan club was considered a ship.
Yep.
That's right, exactly. And I was
'cause
part
I
of one of
remember.
those.
And yeah,
Wow.
you were each crew members to a ship.
Yeah.
Yep.
I do remember that, yeah.
Yep. So and I was there.
I was either too young or too nerdly to be involved in that. But, neither here nor there.
Or not nerdly enough.
Not nerdly enough.
There you go.
Actually, I would probably fall into the not nerdly enough category because at that time in my life, I was a little bit busy romping through the forest and hills of southern Ontario, catching everything that I could possibly get my mitts on, and taking them home to keep as pets.
And then make them fight
And
other
now you
people
do
who
the
collect
same
them.
thing with Pokemon Go.
That's why Pokemon Go doesn't impress me that much. I did it for real.
There you go.
Rattlesnake, I choose you! Wait, maybe not. I did find a rattlesnake once, actually. That really did happen. I did not
Really?
catch it, however.
Well,
I was
that's a
smart
good
enough
idea.
not to.
I was going to say, and then the nerds died out sometime in the late 70s with the Great Rattlesnake Roundup. Right?
Actually, did you hear that thing on Mysterious Universe, Jack, about the snake theory of human evolution?
Yes. That was
is
pretty cool.
bizarre.
That is very cool and bizarre and strange, but very cool. I was going to mention something like that, but I didn't want to muffle too much out of what we're doing.
That's true.
I love that show. That show has got so many cool things in it.
Yep, Mysterious Universe, folks. If you haven't listened to it, you should.
Yep.
Yeah.
So many of my radio dramas have come from a kernel of a weird story that they come up with.
It's a
So,
great source if you're a writer, too.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. By the way, what we're talking about is the idea that humans evolved larger brains because we needed better vision because we were being hunted by, among other things, snakes.
That's right. And then I learned the difference between venomous and poisonous in that episode.
I did, too.
Yeah, I did not know the difference.
It is an educational show.
That's right. Venomous, for those people who want to know, it has to be something that's active, aggressive. So something that bites you and sticks poison in is venomous. Mm-hmm. But if you take something that's poisonous and passively, die from it, that's considered to be poisonous. So if you are poisoned, they will tell you it's venomous poison as opposed to poisonous poison based upon those things. So it's interesting.
Yep, and Jack and I are both teacher nerds, can you tell?
That's right. Yeah. Because we're always learning. There you go. Is that an aspect? Knowledge. Is that an aspect though of nerds? Is that you're always fascinated by learning? Is that one of those elements?
That's an interesting question.
I think you're kind of right. I don't know if it's exactly learning. I think that comes and goes, but I think it's that idea. Because this is a sticking point for me. I think it's that idea that you can see value in something that's entirely intellectual or entirely subjective or entirely imaginative that doesn't immediately directly relate to your life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the whole Carl Sagan, like, let's go on a thought experiment. I do that on a regular basis, and I'll say, well, what if this? And people look at me, but that's not the way it is. Yeah. And my first thought is, man, you're not a nerd, right? Because you can go down these avenues, and it's okay because it's just an idea, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's fun. And yeah, I think you're right in that respect, that there's certainly an element of being able to disassociate. Maybe it's because you're the outsider. Maybe it's because you're not socially adept in the same way. You don't feel nearly as uncomfortable by walking down those strange hallways of other thoughts, of other ways of looking at things.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it.
It's interesting, too, because did you ever see the documentary Metal, A Headbanger's Journey?
No.
Okay.
But it sounds awesome.
It is. And during the interview with... they interviewed Rob Zombie, and he talked about something like that because he said that was one of the things that a lot of metal fans, especially back in the day, were considered the outcasts. And he talked about how you don't kind of decide to be that kid. It's just you develop an interest in things that other people aren't interested in, and now all of a sudden you become the weird kid because of it.
Right. And again, with something like metal, which I never got into, but I recognized there's a lot of really interesting creativity goes on there, and a lot of sort of ancillary, like history, occult, all kinds of stuff that you can look at from a completely like fun way. Right. Not like, you're becoming like a witch or something, and it's in the same way as you would read it in D&D. And go, that's really kind of cool. I didn't know about that. Or listen to these lyrics. They sound really awesome, right? So yeah. And then some people would go, oh my God, they're saying bad words when I play this record backwards. Well, and here's my part where I don't like metal, because I'll say listening to metal reminds me of when my father and I used to cut wood with chainsaws. So that it's that kind of distortion stuff that just sticks in my head.
It depends on the type of metal, but okay, I can see your point.
Every metal group has their acoustic song, and I think that is like, oh my God, the best song ever. And then I listen to their metal stuff, and I'm like, oh my God, why didn't I just listen to the acoustic stuff? But that's because I love acoustic stuff. So anyway, yeah, let's move back to where we were.
So, okay, so we're in the 70s now, and nerd culture has become not exactly mainstream, but organized.
Well, I think this is interesting, because I think Star Wars started something that they didn't know how to get a handle on. Okay. And I think we got, like, this is where nerd culture, like, takes a leap forward, and they go, wow, that was lightning in a bottle. How do I do it? And they had a lot of sort of fits and starts of a lot of different shows that they tried to be able to do, which was Star Wars-like, and never worked, right? And so that's where they were sort of saying, we got a whole group of people here who love this stuff. And we used to make fun of them, and now we don't know what to do, right?
Yeah.
So,
Right.
So
Well-
70s was like that was when mainstream had angst about, like, real angst about nerd culture.
I would agree with that, but I think it goes before Star Wars, though. The 70s was a whole decade of social change, remember, of many kinds, and people looking at the world in different ways. The baby boomers were, of course, now in their, like, 20s and 30s. People were looking at stuff in different ways. There was a whole sci-fi and fantasy boom going on in the 70s, like in general culture, before Star Wars even started.
Well,
I mean,
like what?
well, for
Tolkien.
example, go on.
Tolkien.
Tolkien, yeah, Tolkien was.
Yeah, but I mean, in like that's not general culture, right? Let's be honest. Tolkien wasn't general culture at the time. That was still nerd folks that were enjoying it. We're talking about Star Wars was the first thing that hit everybody.
Yeah,
and blew everybody down. We can go and take a look at stuff like, 2001: A Space Odyssey and stuff like that. But that's kind of science fiction. It wasn't the same kind of like Flash Gordon thing that was for everybody.
Yeah. Well, I think what was happening is, again, the idea of what we'd consider nerddom was becoming tied in with the counterculture. Because I use the example of Tolkien, because when Tolkien came out, nobody cared. What made Tolkien popular was Led Zeppelin.
Okay.
Zeppelin started quoting Tolkien stuff and making references in their songs, and people were like, what is this stuff? And then they'd read, oh, the hobbits smoke up, that's awesome. And
yeah.
And then that led to the late 60s, early 70s. You had kind of on the, amongst the counterculture, you had this sword and sorcery boom. Like that was popular. If you remember, Marvel Comics brought out Conan, and Conan was one of their biggest hits at the time.
But again, isn't that's still not mainstream, is it?
It's I would say it's not. It's counterculture, which at this point I would put between nerddom and normal people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what happened, you're right about Star Wars, that Star Wars was uber nerdy and everybody loved it. And what you had at that point is it sort of, for the audience, became an excuse to be okay with nerdy things.
That's true. I can see. Well, I think 2001: A Space Odyssey did that kind of too.
It sort of did, but again, I think what ended up happening was it didn't do really well in general, and I think because it was too highbrow for an average audience.
That's true.
And
Apparently, it's interesting. Apparently, George Lucas, when he made the movie, he turned to somebody. I just heard an interview with this. He turned to somebody and said, "Oh my God, I've just made a movie that every kid's going to want to watch, and I wanted it to be for the adults."
yeah, But the thing
And he
with
was
that,
really hurt by that. So
George Lucas was trying to make a nostalgia picture about Flash Gordon serials and those things that he grew up
Yeah.
on
Right.
for people his own age. Remember, Lucas, if you actually read about him, didn't really want to be a filmmaker. He actually was being pushed into it by the people around him. Lucas's passion was editing. He was a film editor. But everyone thought he'd make a great filmmaker, and they kept encouraging him to do so.
oh wow, I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, go read Easy Riders and Raging Bulls. It's a book about that period, about that era.
But it makes
And-
sense because he's so meticulous in all of his, like, he has had 7 different companies and just had to be on top of every little piece. And if you're going to be a film editor, that's what you have to be. You just have to be the most meticulous person around.
Yep. Yeah, he really just wanted to be a film editor, but everyone's no, George, you got it. You got to make movies, and so he made THX 1138, and then they're like, oh my God, you got the gift, George, keep doing it, because none of them actually understood THX 1138, but they all pretended to anyway.
And then he came out with American Graffiti.
They came out of American Graffiti, and everyone's like, you got the gift, man, and then he's like, and then he wanted to do something fun, so he made Star Wars. Oops.
And they kept saying that you got the gift, and then he did Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then he did Howard the Duck.
And then everyone said, George, go back to editing.
Yeah, stop making movies, George.
Exactly. Stop making movies, George. But I think regardless, Star Wars is the point where nerd culture and mainstream culture collides. That part I will totally agree with you on.
Yeah. Because I do agree, too, with the idea that it hit and nobody knew what to do with it. And you can tell, because if you look at any ads from the time it came out, they were selling Star Wars everything. And you could tell they didn't know, is this a kid's show? Is this like a grown-up thing? Is this for teenagers? And they were just peppering the market. And the thing was, everything they did, like, turned to gold, except for C-3POs, which were the most noxious thing humanity ever created.
Ooh. But didn't those come later? Those came, like, around Empire Strikes Back time or something later, though. They didn't
I think they were just before.
Okay. But you're right, C-3POs were pretty noxious. Yeah.
Yes. I can still, like, when I think of it, feel that taste in the back of my mouth, and it makes me want to heave a little bit.
Yeah, not the best breakfast cereal in the world.
Is it just I didn't even know it was a breakfast cereal. There you go. No, I do remember it now. I never ate it because my mom always got us healthy stuff, right? It was like would never have like sugary junk as she called it. But do you even remember like the first Star Wars trailer? It actually did not look nearly as exciting. I mean, it was it was entrancing, but but you didn't really know what the hell was going on. And so even the trailers were kind of confusing for people. I just don't think people got it, right? So
I think you're kind of right, but I think that was part of the kick because it came out of nowhere. The advertising was fairly minimal. Like you say, the original ads, you just saw, like, here's a spaceship, here's a hairy monster thing, look, laser swords. And it's like, what the hell is this? And I think that's what made it popular because everybody went into it cold, and then you could get what you want out of it.
That's true.
This is how big it was in my family. We were actually traveling across Canada because it came out in the summer, right? We were traveling across Canada and camping. And for the only time in my entire childhood, we actually all went to a movie theater. Well, we were in some other city somewhere. We didn't stay at the campsite. We went to the movie theater and we watched Star Wars. And the next day we're driving, and it was out west somewhere. And the next day we're driving, and my grandmother had come with us to camp. And I still remember my father just going, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. How could you fall asleep in Star Wars? And he was like so excited and so upset. And my grandmother just smiled and shrugged her shoulders. She was like 65. And she's like, yeah, it kind of bored me. But that's the thing. Is like, it hit every barrier. Here's my father in his 40s at the time going, oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it had that generation, my father's generation on connected.
Yep.
Well, I think like again, and that was I think that's the difficult for anybody who's younger. That's difficult to wrap their head around because we haven't seen that for a while, and a great deal of anything that comes out since the 90s, it's always hyped to death. It's always focus group to death. The closest we had was Harry Potter.
And one other. I'll even give one other. Well, I shouldn't say that. Like Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Harry Potter and The Matrix. The Matrix was one of those things that came out of nowhere.
That's true.
Yeah.
And really took everything by storm.
Yep, that's true.
But that was only the first one.
Right. Well, you mean there's others, Jack?
No,
I think that
not at all.
That's a glitch in the Matrix, man. You don't know what you're talking about.
Well,
although I think Enter the Matrix, the animated ones, is that what it's called?
The Animatrix.
You see those?
Yeah.
The Animatrix, those were awesome. Those were really well done.
Yeah.
Some of those are better than the movies.
Much better.
Yeah.
But that was the thing too, though, that I don't know if I'd count the Matrix quite because it was a technological revolution for film, but it didn't make a lasting impact. Like it's kind of the same thing with Avatar. That Avatar came out, and for 2 months it was the biggest thing ever, and now it's gone.
Right, that's true.
Yeah, I would say that you're right. The technical aspects of the Matrix, the whole spinning 360-degree camera shots, has lasted longer than people's memory of the Matrix, because there's whole generations of kids who've never seen the Matrix.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mind you, there's whole generations of kids now who haven't seen the original Lord of the Rings.
There's that too.
Yeah.
You mean the one that came out in the 70s?
No, the most recent one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like they watched The Hobbit, but
Yeah.
they hadn't seen Lord of the Rings, right? Kind of thing. So, mind you, they hadn't seen Star Wars either. It drives me crazy. So that's what I do. And that's the thing is, there's like this new generation are so specialized, right? We've fractured down to that specialized thing now. It's like I play video games. I don't do that.
Well, there's a catch with that too, though. The thing is, Star Wars was such a revolutionary film, even from a technical point of view, and it was ripped off so much that if a 20-something watched it nowadays, it wouldn't be a big deal because they've seen everything in that movie 100,000 times just because it's the standard.
Normal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I watched Citizen Kane and I can appreciate it for what it did, right?
Yeah,
You're
but
also
that,
I
not
can go-
16.
No, but I mean, at 16 I would have. But at 23 I would have. At 23 I was taking film courses and I was going, holy crap, this Maltese Falcon thing is incredible.
Yep,
but see, that's the catch, though, is you were somebody who was conscientious of what goes on behind a film, and that was important to you, whereas the average person doesn't give a shit. They want to see tits, a car crash, and an explosion.
But this is my point, is that I don't think I think the average person is different today than what they were in that respect, because we've had this glut of geeky stuff, and so they can't possibly experience all this stuff because they're getting it all the time, right? They're getting shows all the time, so all they can do is get their niche and go, I don't want to be a generalist in any of this stuff. I just like this because it's like the fact that we love so much science fiction. You know why? Because we had 3 freaking networks to watch. And they have 4,000, so they don't even know or even care what they missed.
Right. Why should they?
Exactly.
Well, I think you've kind of hit upon a couple of things that I would say started in the 90s and have come up to now. Because what especially our generation would consider nerd culture is mainstream. And I think you do see, for a lot of the general audience, it kind of just comes, like I said, like Avatar. They watched it, it was cool, it's gone because there's so much of it, it doesn't stand out. And I think you're seeing it in the other hand, that you get the diehard super fans that super specialize. And that's why you'll get, like, when Superman in the comics a couple years ago decided to wear his panties underneath his tights, you had, like, this huge wave of nerd rage about, oh my god, you've raped my childhood! Because the hardcore fans, part of nerddom is being the outsider, and part of it is lauding in being the outsider. So if you want to be the outsider now, you really got to work at it.
That's true.
Yeah, so
there is that, yes.
But let's. I think that's right about the 90s. Let's go back to the 80s because I want to argue. Because you were done the 70s, and I think the 80s, I want to argue, was the golden age of nerddom.
I would agree with that. And I would also say that nerddom came into popular culture in multiple ways. Because not only did we have Star Wars, but we had Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. Yep.
Dungeons and Dragons came into the popular culture not too long after Star Wars. And it was a popular game. Like, it was a game that almost everyone played, or at least everyone knew someone who had played. It became a huge thing. Yet it's an extremely nerdy game. It's another example of nerd culture intersecting with mainstream culture. Although at the time it was more mainstream than it was nerd culture.
Well, there was a catch with that too. Because in the early 80s, when we found out it was evil and satanic, D&D was hardcore counterculture.
That's true.
And it was weird and mysterious and people were afraid. But by the late 80s, it had made that shift into what we would now consider more straight up nerdliness, because it wasn't scary anymore. It was what, like, those, like, super geeky dateless wonders did Friday night instead of getting laid.
Not to mention there was just so many other games, I think, by the virtue of just sort of dilution. You know, so you can call D&D satanic, fine. What about Space 1889? What about Traveller? Car Wars is demonic now too, because you can't go there, right? Once you start moving out of that kind of arcane throwing spells, but you play superheroes. Well, you've been watching superhero cartoons and reading comics for, you know, since you were a kid, and now your kid's playing a game where he's a superhero, and you're going to call that demon. So I mean, after a while, that had to sort of slowly dilute the whole, you know, bothered about Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. BADD.
Wasn't that a great little episode I sent you guys?
Yes,
good old fashioned CBC ideas. Yeah, that was great.
And that was another one too that kind of illustrated one of the long running things, because I remember the CBC story you sent. It talks about it, and this was at the beginning of the 80s, and it was funny that you had all of the proponents for gaming. They were all older people. They were all like 30. They were like mature. There was a good, like, healthy male-female mix with the people that they were interviewing and the participants and the stories. Whereas when you'd get to the people that they were interviewing that were critiquing it, the argument was always the same. But the kids who aren't, who they're not really part of this. But the children who aren't really part of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. And that's when, like I said, in the 80s is when you get the return of Star Trek movies that were awesome. You get more Indiana Jones movies that were awesome.
Yeah.
You get a whole bunch of a variety of really interesting sort of speculative fiction that came out, like Groundhog's Day, right?
Yeah.
And movies that you just now you can say for the most part there's a few of them that come out now, but those have been abandoned because they're too risky for Hollywood to do now. It's better to throw something out that they knew was really popular and rebrand it and reboot it than to try something like Groundhog's Day, which was out of nowhere, or War of the Roses, which is one of the darkest comedies,
right?
That I don't think they could ever come out with in a big way like they did back then.
Yeah, well, they could, and one day they will, because if you remember the 80s, one of the reasons you had them taking so many chances was just because they didn't know what the next big thing was. And when you had the home video boom in the early 80s, they needed filler because you wanted to sell and rent tapes. So that's when you got all like the direct-to-video B movies. But a lot of that stuff took off, and the big companies were like, well, they're watching these like cheesy-ass slasher flicks and post-apocalypse barbarian movies, and these things are doing well, so let's do that.
John Carpenter. Mm-hmm. That's his big decade too, right? John Carpenter movies in the 80s.
Yeah.
All effectively B flicks. But I mean, there's tons of stuff too, right? Like Gremlins, and Spielberg takes off with E.T., Close Encounters, although Close Encounters I think is late 70s.
78, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But, you know, E.T. and all those other kind of things, this is like when imaginations and geeks are on like the absolute rise, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they don't understand this is where they really have made that intersection clear.
Yep. Mm. It's the beginning of when nerds start to take over mainstream culture.
I can see that.
There's no question on that. But there are still nerds, though. There's still that divide, right? I mean, that's why we get movies like Revenge of the Nerds and such, which we referred to earlier. I mean, there is still that divide of jocks and nerds, and, you know, the intellectuals are still bad and icky somehow. Yeah. I mean, that idea is still there. And nerd culture is still nerd culture. It's still weird and other. And it's something that cool kids and, you know, proper people don't participate in.
Yeah, but I
think sorry, I didn't interrupt on.
That's okay, go ahead.
Very quickly, I was going to say, I think that's when you start to hear parents go, well, because this is when you get Bill Gates, right? And stuff like that. It's like,
well, that'll
be
the
careful.
90s.
Well, okay, the late 80s, early 90s, right?
Right.
So where you start, late 80s, early 90s, is when you start getting parents go, be careful, don't diss that nerd too much. Because one day he could be worth a lot of money, and he could be really popular, right? Yeah. He could be your boss. He could be marrying material, or she could be marrying material. You know,
that's true. That's very true.
We say he a lot because honestly, for the first part, mostly men were the ones that were defined as nerds.
Let's be honest. I mean, nerddom for most of history. Now, obviously, there were female nerds, but they were never really looked down as nerds. They were just like librarian types or something.
Yeah.
They didn't look down on them, basically, the way they look down on male nerds. I mean...
Yeah, but I think you know where that comes from.
When they take off their glasses, they're really hot and sexy?
No, but you know why most nerds were male?
Why?
I'm pretty sure that what happened was when you had the 50s, the Poindexter type that we'd identify as a nerd started coming about, remember that it was always males that were prime movers.
That's true.
So, because there were plenty of like real life female nerds and people creating nerdly arts who were female going all the way back, but they would kind of be poo-pooed and dismissed because since guys were the main actors, the main motivators, females were sidekicks, and you also had the idea that I think being taken out of that formula as a Poindexter became sort of like a de facto boys club because you were no longer the prime motivator. You weren't part of the thing. You had to sort of find your own niche outside of society.
Okay.
Whereas again, for a female, at least with stereotypical thinking for the time, you could always just attach yourself to a guy.
Yeah, that's true.
So a girl, you could be a bookworm, but when it came time for marrying, you'd put all that aside and marry some guy and have 2.5 kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas
the ultimate... Yeah, I was going to say the ultimate destination for women was to get married.
Yep.
Yeah. And as a guy, if you weren't part of that template, you were sort of on your own. So that's why the image of the nerd, I think, is typically a guy, even though that's not necessarily representative of any point in history.
Right, that's true. Also, there's another aspect to the whole thing, which is that for a lot of males, especially males who didn't fit in, like outcasts and such, like being a nerd was a refuge. Like it was a culture, it was a society, it was a way of thinking, whatever you want to call it, that let you escape from social pressures like, getting a job, getting married, girls, that kind of thing. In fact, I would argue that throughout history, a great many nerds have not really understood women and have maybe even been afraid of them. This is part of the reason why there is a bit of a anti-female slant in a lot of traditional science fiction, is because I'd say a lot of the science fiction writer nerd types didn't really understand women at all. And in fact, this nerd culture was their refuge. Same for comic book nerds, for example. And I think this is important to bring up because later on, when women in modern times start attacking comics and novels as misogynist and all that, as sexist, there's a lack of understanding of why they're that way. And I think that's also where some of the pushback is coming from. But we can talk about that when we get a little more modern.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've got the 80s, which is the golden time of nerd. What happens to nerds in the 90s? Now, we have the computer and internet revolution, but... Go.
Oh, I was going to say, I think you can go back a little farther, because, again, I still believe that we just lived the same 2 decades over and over and over. I think one of the reasons you had the nerd boom in the 80s was because in the 70s, Star Wars made it okay to like stuff like that.
Right.
And I think because in the 60s, when you had the counterculture and you had the baby boomers coming of age and you had them looking at like societal alternatives and stuff that different perspectives were starting to be okay. I think when you got to the 80s, say, and our generation was coming of age, I think we had a lot of parents that were a lot more understanding and tolerant of that sort of thing. And I think that's one of the reasons why you did have this flourishing of more speculative, more imaginative, more not tied up completely in reality kind of stuff.
Right. Oh, we also forgot... Sorry, go, Jack.
Sorry. Heavy Metal Magazine was our version of rated R video games.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Parents didn't really... They thought, it's just comics. So they didn't read Heavy Metal Magazine, just like kids. The parents are like, it's just video games for kids. They don't watch, what's going on with that. So there was that aspect of it, you can say, I think.
Yeah. Although they did have R-rated video games back in the 70s.
Yeah, but a lot of people didn't have a lot of hands on them, right? You couldn't get them as easily.
They were pretty underground.
And they were pretty pointless. I mean,
that's true.
Really,
Custer's Last Stand.
Yeah, you're not going to be touching yourself to this stuff. I mean, seriously.
Yeah, a couple pink-colored blocks moving around on the screen.
Unless you're really weird, but okay.
Well, but I'm sure some people did. Human nature being all. But actually, you bring up an interesting point, Don. We actually forgot to mention about how video games appeared in the 80s, and video game culture, again tied with nerd culture, was super mainstream. Like, even more so than D&D. That was like a super mainstream thing.
Yeah, and I think the video game ties into something else that I was thinking. Because starting in the 70s, one of the things that helped the nerds was that you had a flip of who the typical hero was. So the kids that were the villains in, say, 70s and 80s films were the kids that back in the 50s would have been the hero. Like the well-to-do family, the good upbringing, the perfectly coiffured hair. Like, those were the upstanding kids, and it was like them poor kids who got into crime that were bad. Whereas by the 70s, by the end of the 70s, it was the opposite, that it was the good-natured, hardworking poor kids standing up to those boorish, like usually sociopathic rich kids. And I think that because
with their power glove.
Yeah, power glove. Yep, that's true.
It's so bad, but oh my god! But yeah, and that was part of it. And what you had was this sort of tacit acceptance of the weird, because the outsider and the underdog used to be the weird guy, but now they're starting to get a little more. It's going back to Jack's thing. They're going to take our women from us. But it was seen that more people were the outcast kid than the rich kid, and that was partly why the outcast kid started to become the hero.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, does that go back to things like again those Joseph Campbell stories that George Lucas tapped in on, where you've got because Luke Skywalker is the outcast, right?
Yep.
And so kids are like, yeah, that's the kind of person that I want to be. And a lot of, I mean, if you go back to heroes back in Greek times, they weren't really, for the most part, outcasts.
No, they were like kings and princes and
and sons of kings and stuff like that, right?
True.
Now, some of them might have started off in fishing villages, but they always had that pedigree, right?
Yeah.
Well, not always. I mean, I'm currently reading Oliver Twist at the moment, which, to be honest, I'm sorry, it's my first time reading it at this age. I just finally got around to it. Which, and by the way, it is one of the most fucking hilarious things I have ever read.
Wow.
Have you ever read Oliver Twist?
No. I tried to read the Pickwick Papers, and this is when I was with Shannon, and I'm reading it, and I'm going, this is awful. And she said, and she looked at me and she said, paid by the word, Jack.
Paid by the word.
And I went, okay, that makes perfect sense. No wonder it's going on and on and on. Like, if he had a better editor.
Yeah. No, Oliver Twist, everyone gets like the movie version, which is like super serious, of course, because but if you actually read it and actually understand what he's saying, the thing is a gigantic satire. It's it's fucking hilarious. It's like a huge attack on the society of the day. And all the adults are buffoonish idiots. And the way they are acting, and these comments on class and society and everything, it's really funny, actually. It's I'm killing myself laughing listening to the darn thing. I'm listening to an audiobook version.
Sure.
But going back to my point, Oliver Twist, again, is a example of, the young hero rising up, the young nobody hero rising up, the outcast. You could also go with Great Expectations. I mean, he used that formula a few times, and he's hardly the only person that did. Yeah. The idea of the outcast hero rising up is not new. But most of the legends throughout history are, of course, of great heroes, like the great men, not the outcast. That's true.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, you're right. The modern versions, and I would consider 19th century writing to be fairly modern compared to back in the days of the Greek times.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, if you take a look, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, basically everything that Roald Dahl wrote had some kid whose parents were dead, and he was living with somebody that nobody liked, and you just cried every time you were reading about where his was, or his father, Charlie's father puts on the lids on toothpaste tubes, right? That's his job, right?
Right.
And so yeah, there's that kind of thing, but I think that's a more modern day of that's sort of like the Protestant we can do better kind of aspect.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think that's always been there. I mean, there's always been the outcast becoming the hero, but I think you have a point where Star Wars for our modern society, starting from when the first Star Wars was released, truly did become the template. Like it became the thing that everything else was based on in our society, movie-wise, after a certain point.
Yeah. It's the old story, if you are writing fantasy, you have to deal with Tolkien. You have to either do something like Tolkien or deliberately do something against Tolkien.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you have to, in one way or another, you have to manage what you're doing because he's that much of an effect. And I would say when it comes to space fantasy, science fiction, pulpish kind of stuff like that, it's the same thing with Star Wars. You've got to manage how you're going to appear next to Star Wars.
Or Star Trek. Those are the two poles that you're going to have to deal with one way or the other.
Well, they were.
I know things have changed a little bit, but yeah. And that's something else. Those are the standards for our generation. I think that things have changed since then. There have been definitely some new developments that have affected things. But they are very strong influences.
So what's the new pillars then?
Well, we'll get to that. All right, so that's a little suspense, man. A little suspense.
And that's another story.
And that's
there you go.
Another story. Exactly.
Little hammy hamster for those extra nerds in there.
Ooh, for Canadian nerds.
Canadian nerds,
Hammy hamster. Wow. I haven't thought about Hammy in a very long time, Jack.
Yes, GP the guinea pig. See, there was another nerd.
Yep.
GP
the guinea pig.
He was the inventing nerd.
Yep.
All
right.
ahead.
So there we go. Okay, so in the 90s we have the development of the internet. And that changes things where suddenly you're a nerd, but you're a tech nerd. So you're about making money and such, because we have the first internet boom starting like mid-90s really, and it starts going up from there until the end of the 90s.
Yeah.
And I would say nerd culture and mainstream culture kind of parted ways in the 90s. They were not... But whereas in the 80s, they'd been kind of like running kind of parallel to each other, I would say that they kind of parted a little bit in the 90s. There were video games. I mean, nerd stuff definitely happened, but it wasn't quite as mainstream, I think. At least that's my take on it anyway.
Well, I think you're right, because I think cyberpunk sort of veered away from science fiction too. Like if you were into cyberpunk back in the 70s and the 80s when it first started, you were back on the outside, really.
Yeah.
You were a very minor, because a lot of people were like, what the hell is this stuff, right? They couldn't figure it out. So even by the time you got to the 90s, those people who grew up in cyberpunk and those people, that had developed and brewed and became a part of a new nerd kind of culture there. Yeah.
Well,
Right.
that and I think what ended up happening, cyberpunk's a great example, that by the end of the 90s, it had happened. So it wasn't future speculation. Now it was like retro.
Yeah.
That's true. It kind of happened. Oh, well, that's the other thing, right? The 80s, and I think this goes with what we said about nerd culture from earlier. The 80s was a time of prosperity for most people. Remember, people had leisure time. You didn't have to worry about where your food was coming from. You had time to think about nerdly shit.
Yeah.
Whereas the 90s was not so nice. The 90s was an era of economic disparity in a lot of ways. Still is, but the 90s was kind of the beginning of the 90s was kind of the beginning of that economic disparity. It was the 70s, as Don would put it.
Yeah.
And so as an end result, people weren't that into nerdy things generally because they were more worried about survival. Like you were more worried about the dark realities of life, and you didn't have time for that nerd stuff. So the 90s definitely did not help nerddom because people were more focused on just surviving. In fact, the only major things to come out of the 90s nerd-wise, I'd say, really were Magic the Gathering. There was like the live action role playing and such, which had an effect on nerd culture, but really wasn't ever as mainstream as D&D ever was. Like it did go a little mainstream, but not completely.
Huh.
And anime started its invasion of the United States in a truly earnest way in the like 90s.
I think there's other stuff though, because I think kind of tying in to the everybody's like guts to get paid was the 90s were kind of the peak and the collapse of the nerdly speculator.
Oh, there's that too, yes.
Because that's
the comics. Yeah.
Well, and not just the comics, because by the mid 90s that died, and then it was action figures, and then, but it was again, it wasn't that people were collecting things to enjoy. It was people that were massing things to later sell at an increased price.
Right, right.
Like that kind of...
Is that a hold off from like Reagan economics in the 80s when everybody was trying to get rich and the whole Wall Street, Alex P. Keaton days of everybody? There's another reference.
Part of it.
Family Ties people there. But I mean, yeah, everybody thought, oh, but we're all going to be rich, right? So that was the way to do it.
Well, hold on a sec. I think there's another aspect to it. Remember that in North American culture, traditionally, something has to have monetary value to have value.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the ways that nerddom basically justified itself, and this started during the 80s, was by saying, well, look at these comic books. They have value.
Yeah.
They have monetary value. And therefore, they're to be respected in greater culture, which respects value.
Yeah.
And I think that carried over into a lot of the collector mentality. A lot of stuff, as soon as it had monetary value, society accepted it. And the nerds realized this.
Yeah, because in the 80s, you're getting, the whole Crisis of Infinity Earths, which really got a lot of people's attention. You're getting The Dark Knight Returns, that whole reboot of the DC universe, and even some really strong stories from, like, Chris Claremont and the X-Men and those kind of things. That's really a big aspect. And they were no longer the funny books that kids bought.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they were now collector's items. And as soon as they became collector's items, they became mass culture. As soon as as soon as they became worth something, they became greater culture and accepted. So you were no longer a lonely nerd in your basement with millions of comic books. You were now a collector.
Yeah.
Who was collecting and speculating on comics, and therefore just as respectable as that stockbroker down the street in your own nerdy way.
And in a practical way, in all likelihood, as we found out. But I think that's true, and I think tying into that is what we were talking about earlier, that the 90s were when the big companies were realizing if you cultivated a crop of diehard super fans, it was a ready audience. And I think that was one of the reasons why you would have like the speculator thing, why that started taking off, because you had companies playing into that because they all wanted to cultivate their own group of Trekkies.
Mm-hmm.
Like when the action figure collecting took off, that was the whole McFarlane figures. That was the entirety of their marketing, was that these are going to be collector's items. Awesome, buy 50.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
That's true.
That's completely true. And so actually, I guess we shouldn't say that nerds and nerd culture and mainstream culture went completely away in the 1990s. It was still there, but in a way it was... They were connecting in a different way. They were connecting in more financial ways than they were in cultural ways.
Mm.
But and then you were creating a brand new kind of young nerd group with, like you said, the animation invasion of things like Sailor Moon, right?
Yeah.
It comes crazily bearing in, and Pokemon, and these like really powerful like
Rangers,
cultural, Rangers, Power Rangers, big powerful cultural touchstones that would show up 20 years later.
Yep. Oh yeah.
As we're gonna have a new Power Rangers movie that comes out that's supposed to be really dark, which will be very interesting.
I called it 20 years ago.
He did indeed.
Well, because that's the thing too. I think what started happening, because the 90s when you got Harry Potter, And I think what Harry Potter did for nerddom, and I think what happened kind of parallel, Harry Potter made it okay to be a nerd of any age.
Yeah.
And it was because everybody read the books and they came out. Like, you had kids waiting for days in line, you had adults waiting for days in line.
I'll go even further, Don. I say Harry Potter made it possible for girls to be nerds.
Yeah, I think I'd have to. I wouldn't say made it possible for them to be nerds, because they were all along, but they made it okay for the public to accept that girls were nerds.
I'd go with that.
And to encourage them to be nerds. Like, this is you're gonna have, like, you got nerds on the outside, male and female everywhere, but now you've got girls saying to each other, "Are you reading Harry Potter? I'm reading Harry Potter."
Yeah.
And it's becoming this grand public nerddom that's happening. Because, I mean, I gotta be honest. I mean, more women I know, more girls read Harry Potter than guys did in the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
As a teacher, I can say that. And even now, they still are the biggest fans.
Yeah, but and even then, wussy emo vampires are nerdly, and that's like that was a girl thing since, like, the Anne Rice days, really.
Also, in the 90s, you also got the Sailor Moon boom, which we mentioned there as well, which also made it acceptable for girls to be nerds. Remember, that's where girls as anime nerds come from. Because prior to that, anime was more focused on, like, you know, mecha, like Robotech and Star Blazers and all. It was more focused on the boy stuff. That was one of the first major female-oriented anime that hit, and it influenced a huge number of young girls. That's why Sailor Moon was massive in the 1990s and early 2000s.
And a whole bunch of knockoffs.
There's that too. Oh yeah, lots and
Wedding
lots of
Peach
those.
Powers.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah, that
Wedding Peach Powers activate.
Yeah, that
I make fun of anime whenever I can.
Okay.
No,
that's okay.
I'll join you on that one, because it was the same thing that it's like after Pokemon hit, everything was kids collect things and make them fight, and it's like, really? And then it got to be,
that's right.
Then you got Beyblade. Our tops are like, no, it's a fucking top, kid.
I remember battling tops too. No, it's Beyblade.
Yeah,
what are you talking about?
It's different. No, it's not. Slap. But and I think too, what ended up happening to nerddom in the 90s was you had the big companies realize that nostalgia sells.
Yep. There's that too.
I think that really started taking off, and I think one of the things...
I think you're right, yeah.
Because the big push for that, I think, was the X-Men. That when the X-Men moved out of comics and they did, like, the cartoon on TV and they started the movies, what they were doing is they were taking whoever the currently popular characters were and shoehorning them into the really popular stories from the past. And I think that was kind of the first acknowledgement of the nostalgia sells thing.
Do you think the Batman animated series was the same thing too?
I think what ended up happening, because Batman came out 89, 90, and it was kind of like another Star Wars in that it damaged the entertainment industry, because nobody gave a shit about Batman. Okay, everybody's like, The Dark Knight Returns. That was still this weird little nerdy thing that the average person didn't get. For the average person, Batman was Adam West doing the Bat-Tusi. That was Batman.
Yeah,
True.
that's right.
The movie, nobody expected it to go anywhere. Nobody cared. They were still thinking Adam West, because if you think all the music videos that came out for it, they were very 66 Batman looking.
Yep.
The Bat Dance.
Yeah.
Bat Dance, yeah.
Like it,
And then we went back to that with Batman and Robin and Batman Forever, because it kind of went back to the 60s.
There's a catch with that, though, because so the Batman movie comes out and it's a mega hit, and everybody lost their shit because nobody cared. And that was what you had happen is everybody bought the rights to everything. And that was when you started, they licensed every comic book out there for film, even though most of them never got done, because they just didn't know. How did this catch on? This was some dumbass show I watched as a kid. And I think that started the nostalgia wave. That started the remake, the reboot wave. The Batman animated series came out, and it only came out because the movie was such a hit. But I think they were still trying to kind of do their own thing.
They definitely were, yeah.
Yeah, because it's not really nostalgic, because they added a lot of new characters to it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Harley Quinn.
Yeah. Well, even then, like Officer Montoya, I think was introduced in the show, and she showed up in the comic. And Red Claw wasn't from the comic, and they added a lot of like background stuff that hadn't really appeared in the comic, and they fleshed things out more. Because again, I think it was they were doing their own thing, but it was riding that wave from the movie.
Right.
Yeah, it had that old-fashioned Art Deco kind of look to it, which was really cool.
Yeah. Well, it was basically meant to be, there's been 60 years of Batman, we're going to take it, and not 60, be more like 40. There's been 40 years of Batman, and we're going to take it, and we're going to basically sort through it and give you the best of it. Like, here's a distillation of the best of all this random Batman stuff that's been around for 40 years.
Because as I recall, too, Mr. Freeze in the animated one, they'd never really fleshed him out. Like, as I recall in the comic, he was always just, I will rob the bank because this accident gave me powers and grr. Mm-hmm. Whereas the idea of his wife and him wanting to cure that, I think that came from the animated one as well.
I bet it did.
Yeah.
I bet it did.
I bet you it did too, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then Arnold Schwarzenegger stole that gig.
Yep.
Yeah, and that... Well, because the thing
I guess what's worse, though, is the Bane they had in that movie. That was the only superhero movie that I literally almost walked out of, was Batman and Robin. Mm-hmm. I was in so much pain watching that movie. I swear that my gallbladder burst and everything else. Right. It was just awful, Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, it's okay, because that ties in, too, with a weird Batman aside. It's, again, that nostalgia wave, because everything that comes out Batman-related goes way before like the 90s, except the only bad guy that came out of the 90s that persisted was Bane. Mm-hmm. And even then, every permutation of Bane outside of the comic, he gets screwed. Yeah. Like he's like the dumb thug in that one. The one they just did, he's like the lovesick sidekick to the one villain. And in the comic, he's like a crime boss. He's like the only guy who definitively...
He's amazing in the comics.
Well, he beat Batman.
And broke his back.
Yeah, he's the only villain that definitively ever beat Batman. Yet in the movies, he's I don't know.
You're giving me BTSD,
All right, so
we're getting offside there. Yeah.
Okay, we better get back on focus. Okay, but it's interesting, Don, that you brought up the X-Men, because I'd say the X-Men is actually the start in a weird way of where nerd culture is right now. Okay. Because the X-Men movie that's where I'd started, is in a lot of ways the beginning of the modern era of superhero movies. And I'd say that it's that modern era of superhero movies, especially the Marvel movies, that have really helped to make nerd culture mainstream. Okay. That combined with the generation of young people that grew up in the 90s. So to them, this nerd culture, video game, anime stuff, that's all completely normal. That to them is this like normal youth culture. They don't differentiate it. They don't see it as any different because, well, yes, of course everyone loves superhero movies. Of course everyone goes to see them. Of course everyone loves Batman. Of course. And you go through this. And the thing is, they've grown up with a lot of culture that really wasn't that bad. I mean, we had comic books. They, in the 2000s, had actual decent animated series. Yeah. Not just Batman the Animated Series, but I'm talking, of course, about some of the Cartoon Network stuff, like the Justice League series that they did. Yeah. And, oh my God, now I'm blanking on them. But the 90s have done... Anyway, the key point is this, is that they've actually had a lot higher quality, I'd say, nerd culture to deal with or to enjoy than we have. And as an end result of that, they have been able to grow up in a time where nerd culture, what we would call nerd culture, is completely mainstream. It's the norm to them.
I think nerd culture also ended up creating, like, when you talk about the X-Men series, the original 3 that came out, I think that was, in some ways, nerds pushed away the episodic format.
There's that too.
And moved towards like a continuity. Because nerds love continuity. Right? Yeah. And so now you're finding almost all shows have continuity because they know there's going to be somebody who's going to glom onto it and go, oh. 3 episodes ago, he was actually, his right eye was blind, and now his left eye is blind.
Yep.
And back in the day, they went, who cares? Like, we're just telling a story here. Nowadays, continuity is key, and so you're seeing that happening in the movies in such a way that all the Marvel universe and now the DC universe misstep as it's made every single time. And I'm talking about you, Comic Girl 19. You're amazing. Go watch her YouTube thing. But yeah, she's sitting there. She's having she's having like an existential crisis after watching Suicide Squad, going, DC, just burn everything to the ground and start over again.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Tell good stories, right? And so Marvel has taken this time so that you can find, a poster on the wall in Ant-Man, which reflects back to the Avengers movie, which reflects back to they're all integrated for the nerds out there.
What makes marketing easier?
Well, I think you're right that's a gift with a mixed blessing that the nerds brought to pop culture. But I think it goes a little bit before the X-Men movies. Mm-hmm. Because the first time you really heard that was Babylon 5. And that was the selling point, was it's got a story arc. Yes, it does. It's boring and derivative, but it certainly does.
I love
I'm going to grab my thing of popcorn here. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to enjoy this fight. Gentlemen, don't let me stop you.
This is a whole other episode.
Time for the fight.
Sure. You can shave off. You can shave off season 1 and season 5, but 2, 3, and 4 are magical elements of television. It's the first show that actually did a novel to television.
See, and
people argue that The Prisoner was, but it wasn't even nearly as, it was far more together than The Prisoner.
Well,
The Prisoner was far more disjointed.
And I do think that Babylon 5, again, for better or worse, is the thing that started continuity as a thing for TV and movies and such. Like, I do think that's where it started, because, like I said, when it hit and the internet was kind of just starting, that was what everybody said was what made Babylon 5 super awesome, was that it was one big continuing story.
Yep, that's true.
Absolutely. Like, I mean, the Doctor, and I could do a whole thing on Babylon 5, but the Doctor has, it gets addicted to stims. Mm-hmm. And they do that storyline over, like, 3 seasons. Uh-huh. So you see him start, you see him go through it and deny it, you see him finally come to grips with it, you see with him leaving until he can handle it, the whole bit, and then you've actually got, like, literally character arcs. Every one of those characters had beautiful character arcs within the stories. But then you have Next Generation, where Geordi LaForge gets entirely brainwashed by the Romulans, and the next episode, he's fine, because at the very end, he's talking to Deanna Troi, and she makes him magically perfect again. Mm-hmm. And that just made me so angry, because it was never mentioned again.
Right. See, that was the thing that I remember all the Babylon 5 fans like going on about. But I still didn't like the show. I mean, Rob probably remembers there was Babylon 5 and the X-Files that everybody we hung out with loved. And I used to tell them, episode to episode, season to season, exactly what was going to happen.
And he was right. He was actually right. He was dead on, pretty much. He predicted all of it.
Yeah, Tim used to get mad at me for ruining X-Files. Could say, and the season finale, this is where he's going to actually find out what happened to his sister. Well, no, he did. Fuck you. Yes.
Well, the thing is certainly I agree with you. X-Files I think for me, X-Files played itself out by season 3. Because it was the same thing. It was a monster hunt, basically, almost every episode. Okay, before the break, this is what will happen. After the break, this is what will happen. Very formulaic.
Oh, yeah.
Babylon 5, it kept me guessing, and that's a big, hard thing for them to do. And the callbacks that they had in Babylon 5 were fantastic for me. Anytime they mentioned something, they obviously, they seeded something one episode that they may not come back to for a couple of seasons.
Yeah.
And but they always did. So they never left you hanging. I'm talking you, Lost. They never let you hanging. They actually completed the whole thing.
That's true.
Now, did you guys watch the entire series or not?
I've seen it more than once.
Yeah.
You've seen the entire series more than once?
Oh, yeah. Because of the
Okay.
way TV was back in the day, I usually tended to see each episode twice, and then I would watch them again when they were in syndication later on. There was a time when they were
Okay.
being shown here. Was it Omni TV had them, and they
Yeah.
showed them every weeknight.
No, Space, the Imagination
No,
Station.
Omni had them. Omni had them at
I
one
don't
point.
even know what Omni is.
Omni's a multicultural channel out of Toronto.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
And Channel
Okay.
4 on your cable dial in Toronto. And they actually showed them it was either at 6 or 7. I think it was at 7 that they were literally showing them every weeknight. And that was actually for about 2 years there. They had them when Space didn't have the rights. I think it was before Space got the rights to them.
Yeah, it was,
Wow,
it was still
okay.
just a regular TV show.
And and then I watched through that time. So I've seen Babylon 5 through probably about 3 times. And I'm still more with Dawn than I am with you.
Well, because my problem with something like that, because when Story Arc became a big deal, I wasn't real thrilled simply because ever since I was a little kid, we watched the Japanese stuff, and that's how they'd been writing their shows since the 60s.
Well, that's true. The Japanese... Well, here, let's just not say the Japanese. The rest of the fucking planet. The rest of the fucking planet... Sorry to get sweary for a second here. I'm following Jack's example. The rest of the planet has been basically making serialized TV since forever. In pretty much every form. It was just the Americans that decided to make TV with no consequences or continuity and decided that was the best way to go because of the American system, basically. Yeah. Whereas the British, all their stuff generally had continuity. I mean, even Latin America, they're called telenovelas for a reason, because generally speaking, they're a TV novel. They were basically taking classic love story novels and following them through, which, surprise, have an ending. Japanese stuff has an ending. Live action, animated, doesn't matter. They all have endings. It's just American stuff that was designed to go on for flippin' ever.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's my rant. But that's something that always annoyed me as a kid about American TV. I mean,
It was your turn. It was your turn to rant.
Yeah, thank you.
We're glad.
I appreciate that. Well,
No
that was one
problem.
of the things that I hated about TV as a kid in the 70s and 80s. Being a nerd, among other things, the one thing I didn't like about Star Trek, for example, is the lack of continuity between it. Although Don has since pointed out, the original series, if you watch them in order, has more continuity than you realize.
Yeah.
It does actually.
It does actually have more continuity than you realize. It has more continuity than Next Generation.
Way more than Next Generation.
Which drives me crazy. Yep. And that's what I liked about Enterprise. But we're also getting off.
We are actually. There is another '90s series. Sorry to interrupt. That actually is the one everyone talks about, though. When they talk about our story arcs, though, they don't talk about Babylon 5. They talk about Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Oh, okay.
No, but I believe don't quote me on this one, but I believe I have heard somewhere that Whedon actually took some of his inspiration for the way he did Buffy with the arcs and that from Babylon 5. At least that's what I've heard somewhere. But I may be wrong.
We can go back even earlier than that. We can go back to the 80s and Twin Peaks.
That's true.
Yeah, but
Twin Peaks was the beginning of the 90s, actually.
Was it
Because
really?
it was running when I was in my first year of university, and that was 1990. So
I think it started in the 80s. I think it's another of those 89, 90 things.
Or maybe I'm talking about the Twin Peaks TV series, but there was a miniseries before then that was in the 80s. That might be the case.
Yeah, the final episode was in 91 in
So okay, I'm wrong. I'm talking about the series that came later on.
No. But the first episode was in 90s. It was only 2 seasons, right? That's the television series, right?
Right. Yeah.
So you're right. It's 91.
So, see,
Very cool.
we're proving the point actually about nerds being obsessed with continuity, aren't we?
Even in our own lives.
Even in our own lives, we're absolutely obsessed with continuity. And, notice how we're structuring or attempting to structure this podcast about time, chronological continuity.
Yeah.
That's right.
Because that's what it's all about, right? It's all about the flow of history, the flow of culture, the flow of time, and there's a continuity there. And nerddom is part of that continuity. Like, nerds were not mainstream culture, and now they are. Now, because we're starting to run out of time, so let's do a little shift here then. So, what is nerd culture now? If nerd culture has become mainstream culture, then what's left for the nerds at this point? I mean, right now... Well, let me give me a moment. Right now, we've got the interesting thing where there's a lot of backlash against nerd culture for being sexist and misogynist and whatever else, racist, whatever. And as I talked about earlier, I think some of that's the result because nerd culture was a refuge for, in North America, white males staying away from those aspects of society and reality they just didn't want to deal with. And now that culture has kind of been dragged into the light, so it's under the magnifying glass.
Yeah.
So where do these like weird nerds go then if they want to not be mainstream? Like what's non-mainstream nerd culture now?
Awkward silence.
Porn.
See,
No, that's super. That's
That's
super mainstream culture, Jack. Porn's gone mainstream.
That's true. I guess.
Have you seen the internet?
Exactly.
Star Trek porn?
There has to be first-gen Star Trek porn, or it doesn't count.
Well, here's something to keep in mind, okay? The stuff that we consider nerd culture, this great Colbert makes jokes about that during his monologues, and people laugh because they all know what he's talking about, or at least they pretend they do.
And he is a nerd.
Yeah.
He plays D&D himself.
He's a super nerd,
right?
or at least he did back when he had time.
He's been in the Hobbit movies.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. But that's my point, though. Nerd culture is so mainstream, late-night comedians make jokes about it, and most of the audience gets it. So what's left for the nerds? I mean, this ties, of course, into where nerdom culture is going from now. But
no, it's an even bigger question, because does that make them nerds anymore?
Yeah, I think I gotta...
If it's all mainstream, you're no longer a nerd.
Yeah.
Because the whole aspect of being a nerd is being a social outcast.
That's true.
See, I think because what ended up happening, society stopped by the end of the 90s. And I think what happened there was the big companies that got the hang of marketing. And thanks to the internet and that, now you can market to every specific little group you want. So there really isn't the idea of a nerd as an outcast isn't a thing anymore. And again, this is something you'll see if you remember back for your 80s cyberpunk, that everybody is a counterculture now. That everybody is part of some little small specific marketing group. And because of that, there really isn't mainstream anymore.
Ah, okay.
So it's deconstructed in such a way that, we're now just segments.
So society is completely fragmented, is what you're saying. We're a whole bunch of different little marketing segments, as Jack said, or fragments.
Yeah, and every now and then, like, one will float to the surface, and it'll be a thing for a while, and then it goes away. And like we were all together talking about for the invention of teenagers, about how nobody complains about anything. I think it's because, again, everything just sort of bubbles around. So whatever comes to the surface can't really create a new paradigm, because the current paradigm is that, well, there's all this stuff, it's like a stew, and every now and then you get like a big chunk of steampunk, and every now and then you get a slice of superhero, and maybe it's like a romance story, maybe it's an action story, and it all just kind of froths around.
Right.
I mean, yeah, I think you're right in the respect that I think even things like fashion and hairstyles and clothing styles, they've been stalled since the 90s.
Yeah.
Like, you can go back to the 90s and watch a 90s show, and 9 times out of 10, except for the faded quality of the film, it'll still resonate with what people are wearing today, for the most part.
That's interesting. You're right. I mean, the 80s is still distinctive, but the 90s isn't that different than today.
Yeah.
Because now they're not selling to them what they're wearing as much anymore. They're selling to them these segments of what you could be. What is your nerd? That's what it is. It's what is your nerd now. There's no longer nerds. It's what is your nerd. And that's all they're interested in.
And that's all they're interested in. You're right, actually. And that would tie in with something else that I've heard about. And you can confirm this, Jack, about high school, that I heard that there aren't really, like, cliques anymore. Not in the same sense that there were when we were young. There's not that nerds and jocks and cheerleaders and all that stuff, which was a little more of an American thing. But I've generally heard they don't exist anymore. Like, everyone belongs to their own little groups that like stuff and that, but it's not socially stratified. It's not set up like it was when we were young. It's actually quite different. And that makes sense.
Well, And also things like cell phones and stuff like that have helped destroy it too, because that you can have your nerd and not look like anything, and text each other most of the time and not have those one-on-one. You don't have groups getting together the same way unless they're in some sort of activity.
Yeah.
Whereas we would hang out with D&D kids, and the soccer guys would hang out with themselves after the game. You know what I mean? All that kind of stuff. Now people go and play their own video games, and everybody does it. Or somebody goes and they text from somewhere, and everybody does it. And so those kind of barriers have broken down based upon technology. And again, the advertisers telling you, what's your nerd? We'll sell to that.
Right. So everyone's a nerd now. Huh.
And I think you hit on another aspect of it kind of sidewaysly, is that back in the day, if you wanted to gain some serious nerd cred, you had to put the work in. Like if you wanted to hang with the comic crowd, you actually had to read the comics. Whereas nowadays, if I want to know what toe did Wolverine stub in issue 199 of the X-Men, I can just look it up on the internet.
That's true.
Yep.
That's very true.
Yep.
I think, though, that there are nerds, but in the sense that there are those who are involved with nerd culture, what we would traditionally have called nerd culture, at least for the last 30 or 40 years, but that are so deep into it that I think there are levels of it. I think there are still...
Here's where I'm going to tell you where the nerds are still.
Okay.
The people who are creative.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
The people who are not just buying whatever the culture is in, but the people who are writing it themselves, who are drawing it themselves, who are making it themselves. Those are the few leftover real nerds.
Interesting.
I don't think they're that.
Sense.
But I don't think they're that few anymore. Like I think.
Well, the nerd brings the internet brings everyone together, right? No matter how small your niche, everyone's brought together. So you're no longer a few; you're one of many.
But I mean, not. But go ahead.
Go ahead. No. You go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say it's the idea nowadays anybody who plays role playing games is also a role playing game designer. Like, I think that's more... Same thing with, if you read comic books, you at least dabble in making comic books. Like, the Nerdly Arts, there are very few participants who aren't actually practitioners, I think.
I disagree.
Okay.
There you go. I disagree entirely.
Too, actually.
Looking from at the younger generation, I would say our generation is... But I would say the generations below me aren't nearly as much. Because they have so much opportunity for distraction. They go, why would I bother making my own comic when I can go online and read as many as I want? Why would I bother going ahead and writing my own world when all I have to do is plug in my PS3 or my Xbox and I can play an entire world of, or worlds of multiple games that are on there? I find less kids taking the time to write than when I was a kid.
I would agree with that, sadly. I'd say that there is so much to enjoy that most of them don't actually ever think of creating. That they really don't. And when they do create, as someone who's taught writing like Jack has, I can say that the stuff that they do tends to actually be really, really shallow.
Right.
And it's usually just...
derivative.
Derivative.
Crazy derivative.
Yeah, the stuff, it's super derivative. Because that's all they know. Mind you, the stuff I produced when I was their age was probably also super derivative, so I'm not really throwing stones that way too hard.
They just have more to work from.
Yeah, they do. They have a lot more to work from.
Yeah.
And so it's hard for them. But I'd go with this idea point. I'd go with Jack on this one, that I think that not as many people become creators as you think. Now, do they have the opportunity? I would say yes. They have more opportunity to become creators than any other time in human history. Yeah. They have more opportunity to find an audience. They have more opportunity to get their ideas out there, to interact with artists, to do everything. Absolutely, they have more opportunity, but they don't take it. They do not use that opportunity. They think about their cell phones. Their cell phones are the greatest multimedia devices in the history of mankind. They can produce multimedia at incredible levels. They can write, they can film, they can record, they can do anything. They can mix music, they can make movies on their cell phones. but they sit there and text.
Huh.
Yeah.
Because that's easier and more entertaining. Humans are lazy creatures. And if you offer them the easy way out, they will take it 9.9 times out of 10, they will take it.
Huh.
Yeah.
Maybe my thing is skewed because I don't have friends anymore, so most of the people I associate with like online are creators of something.
But a lot of them are also
Sure,
part of our generation.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, the internet masks how few we are by bringing everybody in the world together in one room.
Yeah, that's true.
So, if there's like 2 billion people who speak English and there's 12 people that make action figures, you're like, wow, I'm surrounded by people who make action figures. But then you start realizing, wait a minute, there's nobody else in my city that does this.
Yeah.
There may be nobody else in my province that does this.
Huh.
So that's a whole different thing. Whereas you go back to the fanzines, ton of people could get together.
Yeah.
At least 6 or 7 people in your town could get together and write something.
That's true. And that was very common. Well, somewhat common anyway. Among the nerds, exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess that would mean that nerd culture is in a way now just culture.
Yeah.
There is no longer a differentiation anymore, and presumably that will stay for the future. I mean, yes, there are the true outcasts who are just so weird that they don't belong in any form of mainstream culture.
Well, they get into politics now.
Well, that's true.
They become pundits,
and they do political nerds,
and they become advertisement to sell back to us, right? It's that whole what was that whole phrase where they said, first you have a really good idea. Then eventually it becomes like so sold out that it just gets sold out back to you. I forget. There's like a 3-step thing that happens to it. So, and that's where we're at with nerddom, right? Like where it was something that was like outsider art, outsider people. Then suddenly, whoa, this is really cool. Now everybody wants to be a part of it. Now it's cool to be a nerd. Now what is a nerd?
Yeah.
Because we all have our nerdy things.
Yes, exactly. Everyone either plays video games or reads like online web comics or watches Marvel movies. I mean, they are part of mainstream culture. They're no longer nerdy culture anymore.
Well, in some ways, maybe because when you talk about that, there's no activity that average people look at and go, oh, look at them weirdos. Like, I can't really... I'm thinking even at work, we had one of my supervisors was all excited because he saw a genuine steampunk.
Oh.
One of the guys playing the machines had the guy, and it wasn't a fast, it was just a guy who looked like that. But he wasn't getting stared at by everybody else in the place. And I can't think. The only thing I can still think of that people go, yeah, and even then it's kind of become more of a punchline than an actual genuine would be like the furries.
Yeah, it's more of a joke than a scary thing.
Yeah, like
because they go,
they're like the last bastion of nerddom that you can still kind of at least I'm not one of you for now.
I don't know. There's always like the hardcore, like the guys who collect sex dolls and dress them up and things like that. I think they're still thought of as kind of being social outcasts. There are always people who write dinosaur porn, for example, to go back to our regular punchline, are not considered normal even among the erotic writers. Although again, a lot of the erotica writers, from what I've noticed, seem to actually kind of admire them, but still.
But it sells. Like that's the weird. Like I say, there isn't. It's kind of like I can't. Yeah, except maybe the dinosaur porn thing, which I totally. But even then, if you make a reference, people know what you're talking about, and I think
that's the scary thing. Yeah,
because there's nothing occult, and I mean occult in the literal sense of hidden or obscured. Like, there's no thing. And I think, again, it goes with that idea of the internet, that no matter what is this? There's dinosaur porn? I can look it up right away, and God help me be an expert in a matter of minutes.
That's true.
And I think that may have led to the extinction of the nerd, because unless you're actually skinning your neighbors and eating their organs, there really isn't too much out there that, and even then, somebody's still going to write you letters in prison. But yeah, there's nothing that's real obscure. There's nothing out there. There's nothing that's truly avant-garde.
And let's remember, come on, like you were saying about, buying sex dolls or whatever like that. That's just being an outsider doesn't make you a nerd.
That's true.
Being a Unabomber doesn't mean you're a nerd, right? Just because you're an outsider, there are other elements. There's an intellectualization that goes on there. There's a reading aspect that goes on there. There's an actual cultural thing that goes on there as well. So
that's true.
So yeah, there's outsiders. That doesn't mean there's nerds that are outsiders anymore.
Now, here's the weird thing though. If everyone is now a nerd, okay, and North American society still has its anti-intellectual bent, how does that make sense anymore then?
Well, I don't think everyone is a nerd, though. I think everyone has a nerd.
Yeah. Okay.
You know what I mean? They have a nerdy thing. Okay. So that's what makes it okay, right? So for example, one of my teachers, she's into princesses, Disney princesses. That's her nerd, as far as she's concerned. Everything else, she's like white bread. This way she puts it, right? I'm just like normal, but I'm like an absolute freak for Disney princesses. So, everybody has their nerd, so they have their connection to nerddom that way. But the people like you and me and Dawn and the people who are our age, we're the elder nerd. We're the ones that liked all of this kind of stuff. Because it was outsider. Now that it's all insider, they get to pick and choose, and there's no social moria against it.
Yeah.
Whereas there was for us, right? There was absolutely a problem being a nerd in our age.
Yeah, that's true.
Not for them. That's why they can pick and choose. Now it's just like going to the supermarket. Oh, I'll have some anime, please. And I'll have this, and I'll have that. And there's no concern about having any kind of social backlash.
Yep, that's true.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, and I think that again is why you get so much hardcore nerd rage, because it's if you're going to declare yourself a hardcore true fan of something, you got to be damn hardcore to stand out amongst everybody else partaking of it. Hence the once Superman decides to put his undies on the inside, the living outrage.
Right.
The one that did it for me, which I think is again kind of illustrates my point, which is where my nerd rage totally dissipated and I thought people are dumb, was when Enterprise came out. I remember the first episode came out, and there was a lot, if you were an old fan, not to like. But there was this group of people that were super vocal and super adamant that Star Trek was now ruined because there were words to the theme song.
Yep. Yeah, I remember
that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, really?
Which my son now sings regularly.
Okay.
Because we were watching it together. We're watching Enterprise, my middle son and I, and he walks in singing, "I've got faith in the heart." It's like, okay, I'm done now with that. But thanks. That was.
Star Trek Beyond was such a love letter to Enterprise. I'm surprised they didn't have the theme in there somewhere.
Well, yeah, it sounds like it's going to take place like 10 years before Kirk. And
I said Star Trek Beyond, cool. not Star Trek Discovery. That's a different one.
Oh no, Discovery. Oh yeah, Star Trek Beyond is the movie.
Star Trek Beyond.
Really? You think it's an ode to Enterprise?
Yeah, there were so many Enterprise. Spock's wearing an Enterprise uniform. Didn't you notice that?
Look at it. No, didn't notice that.
He's wearing one of the Enterprise jumpsuits. And when
I was kind of falling asleep through Star Trek Beyond.
Well, yeah, people either are bored to tears by it or loved it, but that's entirely different conversation.
Yeah, that's our Trek conversation. I want in on that one.
But no, there's references to Makos. There's like tons of references to Enterprise after a certain. Once they find that ship, it's like Enterprise reference after Enterprise reference from that era, anyway.
Right.
So it's a love letter to Enterprise, practically. Okay, so I guess the final answer then is, it's as you said, that there are no nerds because everyone has their nerd now. Everyone has their own little nerdy bit that, as Jack said, they pick and choose, and therefore there is no nerd culture anymore. Not really.
Yeah. So join us next time for the Department of Average Affairs.
Well, that's exactly it. I think we should
Right.
show...
This will be the last episode of the Department of Nerdly
Apparently.
Affairs. Thanks for having me on. It's like...
Apparently we need to change the show title. Wow, okay. So, yes, any final thoughts?
Well, no, there's still nerdly affairs, right? There's still nerdly things to talk
yeah.
about. You get to pick and choose, right?
Especially
But,
a lot of the things that we talk about on this show are actually almost quasi-historical in a way. Like we've got a more of a backward-looking focus often, not always, but
Yes.
but because of that, we're talking about things that were nerdly in their time, and have been nerdly for most of our lives.
Oh no, you're going to start calling this the Requiem to the Nerdly
The
Affairs.
Requiem to the Nerdly Affairs. Wow, that would be an interesting. We'll talk about the future too and everything, but we do a lot of like historical cultural stuff that I think. So I think it's okay to call this the Department of Nerdly Affairs. But you know, when we were coming up with this show name, though, I will tell you that we went through hundreds of options because everything related to geek and nerd as a podcast title or blog was taken.
Yeah.
Oh my God, was it
Of
ever?
course.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so that there's another example of how nerd culture is the mainstream culture, at least on the internet it is anyway.
For sure. But let's be honest, nerds were the first ones on the internet.
Absolutely they were.
Yeah.
So we took over, we ruled, now we own everything there.
Back before the internet, when it was a BBS.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's right.
I was there.
That's before when it was BBS and you called people's houses and they had phone line BBS.
And a modem was something you had to
Whoa.
stick your phone in the modem.
That's right.
All right, guys, this is too nerdly for me. I'm out of here. Okay. So on that note, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Don. And thank you, Jack, for coming on and helping us discuss the true nature of nerdliness.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. It's always a pleasure.
Good night.
Right.
Night.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! Come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.